The date is July the 1st, 1944. The Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, is sealed off from the outside world. In the Grand Hall, the air is thick with cigar smoke. Delegates from 44 allied nations shuffle papers and glance toward the British table. The empire that once financed the world can no longer finance itself. Across the room, the American delegation waits in quiet confidence. On that carpet, under crystal chandeliers and wartime tension, the financial crown of the world is passed from pound to dollar, and a new monetary order is born. For more than 2 centuries, Britain had been the axis of global finance. London priced the world's trade, insured its ships, and underwrote its wars. The pound sterling was not just paper and metal. It was a promise backed by an empire that stretched from Africa to Asia. Yet by the summer of 1944, that promise was breaking. 2 total wars in a single generation had bled the country dry. Behind the polished speeches in that hall, there was an unspoken admission. Britain could no longer afford to be the banker of the world. Across the Atlantic, a different story had unfolded. While Europe's cities burned, American factories roared. The United States had become the world's industrial workshop and its primary creditor. Gold reserves flowed into American vaults, and wartime production turned the dollar into a symbol of stability and strength. By the time those delegates arrived in Bretton Woods, the outcome was largely predetermined. The question was not whether the dollar would replace the pound, but how the rest of the world would be persuaded to accept it. What happened inside that New Hampshire hotel was more than a meeting over exchange rates. It was the latest expression of a pattern that has shaped global power for more than 5 centuries. A currency rises with an empire's strength. For a time, it appears permanent. But the system's very success plants the seeds of its decline. Expansion demands protection. Protection requires armies, fleets, and bases scattered across the planet. Costs grow faster than income, and debt fills the gap. That cycle began long before the dollar and the pound. In the 15th century, a small Atlantic kingdom on Europe's edge used ships and maps to change the world. After the old land routes to Asia were choked by hostile powers, Portuguese navigators traced a new path around Africa. The Portuguese real became a passport, accepted in ports from West Africa to the Indian Ocean. Maintaining distant outposts demanded garrisons, fleets, and constant spending. Rivals emerged, political fractures opened. By 1580, Portugal was absorbed into a larger Iberian Union, and its monetary primacy disappeared. Spain stepped into the vacuum with a different kind of power. High in the Andes, at Potosi, a single mountain yielded nearly half of the world's silver for decades. Pieces of 8 minted there circulated from European courts to Asian port cities, becoming the first truly global coin. Torrents of silver brought inflation rather than permanent prosperity. Prices soared. The crown borrowed heavily to fight wars it could not afford. When the flow of silver slowed, defaults followed, and the world gradually turned away from Spanish coinage as its unquestioned standard. In the 17th century, the focus shifted north to a republic of merchants and bankers. Amsterdam became Europe's clearinghouse. The Dutch guilder, backed by the reputation of the Bank of Amsterdam and innovations like the first true stock exchange, became the preferred unit for settling international accounts. Yet, the same dynamic reappeared. Trade networks that enriched the Dutch pulled them into costly conflicts, especially with the rising British. Naval wars and overextended enterprises strained the system. As their balance sheets weakened, so did the guilder's dominance. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain had fused industrial might, naval power, and financial sophistication into something larger than any of its predecessors. Coal, steam, and factories turned the island into the workshop of the world. The empire's web of colonies and trading partners gave it reach, while the City of London provided the credit that stitched the system together. Under the gold standard, the pound sterling was regarded as the most dependable form of money on the planet. Governments held it as reserves. On paper, the structure looked indestructible. By 1922, nearly 1 in 5 people on Earth lived under the Union Jack, and a quarter of the world's land mass was administered from London. But beneath those statistics, the same forces that had broken Portugal, Spain, and the Dutch were at work. 2 industrial-scale wars ripped through Europe in the first half of the 20th century. Britain emerged on the winning side, but at a staggering cost. The country that once financed others' conflicts now relied on foreign credit to fight its own. That is why, in 1944, British officials arrived at Bretton Woods not as unchallenged masters of global finance, but as exhausted custodians of a system they could no longer afford to maintain. The delegates in that room were not merely drafting technical agreements. They were overseeing a transfer of monetary hegemony from a declining empire to a rising one. Every clause, every institution they created, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the fixed exchange rate system tied to the dollar and then to gold, served one overarching purpose: to reorganize the world financial architecture around a new center. For the next quarter century, the arrangement appeared to confirm the wisdom of that choice. The dollar, anchored to gold, became the backbone of post-war reconstruction and global trade. But if history has taught anything, it is that reserve currencies do not remain supreme because of treaties alone. They rise with real power, industrial output, technological capacity, military reach, and they begin to falter when those foundations weaken or when their privileges are abused. The story that began in that New Hampshire hotel is not an exception to the 500-year pattern. It is its latest chapter. To understand where that chapter leads, it is necessary to step away from Bretton Woods and rewind 5 centuries to a time when the idea of a single currency shaping world trade was entirely new. In the mid-15th century, power did not yet revolve around global finance. It revolved around land, dynasties, and narrow trade routes guarded by middlemen. That changed when a small kingdom on the Atlantic fringe began tracing lines on maps that no one had seen before. Portuguese mariners, funded by a monarchy willing to gamble on the unknown, pushed farther down the coast of Africa year after year. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the old spice routes through the eastern Mediterranean snapped shut. The overland arteries that had supplied Europe with luxuries from Asia were now controlled by a power willing to charge heavily or cut them off altogether. Portugal's answer was not negotiation, but navigation. By sailing around Africa, it bypassed the choke points entirely. The caravels that left Lisbon came back laden with spices, gold, ivory, and knowledge, new charts, new currents, new ports. As these routes solidified, merchants and rulers from distant coasts began to accept Portuguese coin as a reliable medium of exchange. The real, minted under royal authority and backed by the flow of overseas trade, began to circulate far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. For roughly 80 years, it functioned as the closest thing the world had to a reserve currency. If one wanted to trade in certain key ports, one needed Portuguese money or something directly convertible into it. But as the network grew, so did its cost. Coastal forts in Africa, island bases in the Atlantic, trading posts in India, outposts reaching as far as Japan and Macau, each one required soldiers, administrators, and ships to protect the sea lanes that made the whole system profitable. Portugal had opened new pathways, but it had also stretched itself thin across 4 continents. When internal political crises hit, including a royal succession dispute, the structure proved fragile. In 1580, Spain absorbed Portugal into a dynastic union. The coin still existed, the port still functioned, But the real was no longer the beating heart of an independent maritime empire. The world's monetary focus shifted. Spain's rise was built not on navigation alone, but on extraction. In what is now Bolivia, at a place called Potosi, a mountain rich with silver ore became the financial engine of an empire. From the mid-16th century onward, galleons crossed the Atlantic loaded with bars and coins minted from Potosi's veins, stamped with the unmistakable marks of Spanish sovereignty. The piece of 8, or Spanish dollar, soon became familiar from Europe to the Americas and even into Asia. It was uniform, widely accepted, and trusted enough to be used in settlements across borders and cultures. For generations, it served as the world's reference coin. Yet the flood of silver that made Spain powerful also undermined its stability. Easy money allowed the crown to wage wars on multiple fronts and maintain a sprawling empire, but it also encouraged a reliance on imports and borrowing. The more silver arrived, the more prices rose. Ordinary people found that the coins in their pockets bought less each year. The crown, facing mounting expenses, borrowed heavily from bankers who demanded repayment in that same silver. When revenues from the mines faltered or shipments were lost, the monarchy had no choice but to default. Spain did so repeatedly, shattering confidence in its finances even as its coins continued to circulate. The empire possessed wealth on paper and in metal, but it lacked the sustainable productivity and fiscal discipline needed to support a permanent monetary order. As Spanish influence waned, a different model took shape in the low, waterlogged lands of the Dutch Republic. There, commercial ingenuity substituted for territorial scale. Amsterdam's harbor became a forest of masts, and its counting houses became synonymous with efficient, trustworthy finance. The Bank of Amsterdam offered merchants a safe place to deposit coin and a reliable ledger system to settle accounts without moving physical metal. The guilder, backed by this institution and by the city's reputation for honoring obligations, became the unit in which traders preferred to reckon their deals. It was not the largest empire that controlled the reserve currency now, but the one that best organized credit and clearing. The Dutch extended their reach through the Dutch East India Company, a joint stock corporation whose shares could be bought and sold on a formal exchange. Marine insurance reduced the risks of distant voyages. New instruments of credit allowed capital to be pooled and deployed more flexibly than before. For a time, this architecture gave the guilder a dominant position in European and global trade. But once again, the pattern asserted itself. Economic success pulled the Republic into the orbit of great power competition. Naval clashes with England, culminating in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, strained the treasury and damaged vital trade routes. The East India Company, burdened by mismanagement and conflict, collapsed under its own weight. The financial heart that had pumped liquidity through Europe weakened, and as it did, London moved into the space Amsterdam had occupied. Britain's ascent combined elements of all that had come before. It harnessed maritime skill, industrial innovation, and financial institutions into a single cohesive system. Coal-powered factories and mechanized production gave British goods a price and quality advantage. The Royal Navy protected shipping lanes not just for Britain, but effectively for much of the world. In the City of London, banks and insurers developed a reputation for reliability. Contracts were enforceable. Credit was available. Under the gold standard, one could exchange pounds for a defined quantity of gold, and that promise was upheld long enough to make sterling the foundation of international trust. By the early 20th century, more than half of world trade was invoiced in pounds. Yet the logic of overextension did not spare Britain. Maintaining a global empire required continuous military expenditure, from garrisons on distant frontiers to fleets patrolling far-flung seas. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Britain financed its massive war effort by borrowing on an unprecedented scale. National debt multiplied several times over in just a few years. The Second World War, barely a generation later, proved even more punishing. By 1945, Britain's government debt had swollen to levels that would once have been considered unimaginable. The country had defeated its enemies, but lost the financial independence that underpinned its monetary supremacy. The transition that took formal shape at Bretton Woods thus did not come out of nowhere. It reflected a hard reality. Economic and military leadership had already shifted. American factories had armed not only U.S. soldiers, but much of the Allied war effort. Gold reserves had migrated to American vaults as European powers sold assets and drew on credit to fund survival. By the mid-20th century, the United States was both the world's largest creditor and its most formidable industrial power. The delegates who gathered in New Hampshire were simply codifying in law and institutions what had already occurred in practice. Under the Bretton Woods system, other major currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself was pegged to gold at a fixed rate. Foreign central banks could, in theory, exchange their dollars for American gold, ensuring that the system did not become a purely fiat arrangement. For a quarter century, this structure seemed stable. The dollar financed reconstruction in Europe and Japan, lubricated trade, and served as the reserve asset other nations trusted when they built their foreign exchange holdings. But no reserve currency remains constrained indefinitely by its own rules. As the United States embraced its role as guarantor of the Western order, it also took on burdens that echoed those of past empires: expansive military commitments, overseas bases, and wars whose costs mounted far beyond initial estimates. At home, social programs and economic management strategies increased federal spending. Dollars flowed out to pay for imports and foreign deployments, while the promise to redeem those dollars for gold remained on the books. By the late 1960s, the arithmetic no longer added up. Foreign governments, aware that the stock of claims on U.S. gold exceeded the gold actually held, began to test the system. In 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility into gold. With the single announcement, the formal link between the world's dominant currency and a tangible store of value was severed. Many expected that this would herald the end of the dollar's preeminence, just as the weakening of previous anchors had heralded the decline of earlier reserve currencies. Yet something different happened. Instead of collapsing, the dollar found a new foundation, not in metal stored in vaults, but in the most critical commodity of the industrial age: oil. The oil shocks of the 1970s exposed the vulnerability of energy-importing nations and the leverage of producers. In the midst of this turmoil, the United States struck a strategic bargain with Saudi Arabia, the leading OPEC exporter. Saudi oil would be priced and sold exclusively in US dollars, and in return, the kingdom would receive American security guarantees and channels to recycle its surpluses into U.S. assets. Within a few years, other OPEC members aligned with this practice. The result was a new architecture. Any country that needed oil, which effectively meant every modern economy, also needed dollars to pay for it. This was the birth of the petrodollar system. Under this arrangement, global demand for dollars remained strong even without gold backing. Energy importers accumulated dollars to pay their bills. Oil exporters accumulated dollars as revenue, then reinvested large portions of them into U.S. Treasury securities and other dollar-denominated assets. The United States gained an extraordinary privilege. It could run deficits on a scale that would have broken the currency of a smaller country, knowing that the world's need for dollars would absorb the supply. For decades, this seemed to validate the belief that the dollar's dominance was not just durable, but almost permanent. At the turn of the millennium, that privilege seemed unquestionable. Central banks around the world held a majority of their reserves in US dollars. At its peak, more than 70% of global foreign exchange reserves were denominated in the American currency. Oil contracts were written in dollars. International loans were structured in dollars. Entire national balance sheets rose and fell with the dollar's fluctuations. For many policymakers and investors, the idea that this system might one day give way to another seemed remote, almost academic. The dollar was not just a medium of exchange. It was the backbone of a global order built in the aftermath of war and held together by American military and economic power. But beneath the surface, the familiar stresses that had undermined previous reserve currencies began to accumulate. In the early 21st century, the United States fought long and costly conflicts in the Middle East and Central Asia. The combined cost of these wars climbed into the trillions of dollars, financed not by immediate taxation alone, but by issuing debt. At the same time, the domestic economy weathered shocks that demanded large-scale interventions, financial crises, recessions, and emergency stimulus measures that expanded the federal balance sheet. Each response may have been justified in isolation, but together they pushed the country further into a position that rhymed with the late stages of past hegemons: high debt, far-flung commitments, and a belief that the currency's special status would absorb the strain. The global financial crisis of 2008 marked a turning point in perception. When major banks and institutions faltered, the Federal Reserve acted as lender of last resort, not only for the US, but effectively for much of the world, opening dollar swap lines and flooding markets with liquidity. This intervention stabilized the system, but it also underscored a deeper truth. The international economy had become critically dependent on access to US dollar funding. Some saw this as proof of the dollar's indispensability. Others saw it as a warning about concentration of risk. Over the following decade, central banks and governments in emerging powers began to explore ways to reduce that dependence, not in sudden moves, but in a slow, deliberate series of adjustments. By the mid-2020s, the numbers told a quiet but unmistakable story. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves, once comfortably above 70%, had fallen below 60%. In its place, a more varied mix of currencies and assets emerged. Gold holdings rose in some central banks. Regional trade deals were written to allow settlement in local units. Foreign investors, who once held more than half of all outstanding U.S. Treasury securities, saw their share decline to around 30%. The United States still financed itself with relative ease, but a larger portion of its debt was now held domestically or by official institutions tied to its own system. The change did not produce a single dramatic crisis, but it signaled a gradual rebalancing of who funded American deficits and on what terms. At the same time, the U.S. government's own obligations continued to swell. Publicly held federal debt climbed above $29 trillion, with total government obligations exceeding $36 trillion when internal holdings were included. Measured against national output, debt reached well over 100% of GDP, a threshold that earlier empires had crossed only in their later stages. This did not mean immediate collapse. Large, advanced economies can sustain substantial debt loads, particularly when they borrow in their own currency. But in the context of 5 centuries of history, it placed the United States squarely in the same zone that Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and Britain had entered before their monetary primacy faded. Beyond the Atlantic world, new coalitions took shape with their own ambitions. The BRICS group, originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, expanded to include additional members such as Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. Together, these nations encompassed a significant share of global population, resources, and manufacturing capacity. Individually, their currencies lacked the deep, liquid markets and universal trust that the dollar enjoyed. Collectively, however, they began to experiment with alternatives: bilateral trade settled in local currencies, regional bond markets, and, crucially, new payment systems designed to route around traditional dollar-based channels. One of these initiatives, a developing network to settle cross-border transactions using central bank digital currencies, offered a glimpse of a different future. Instead of routing payments through New York or London, participating countries could, in theory, clear directly between their own monetary authorities, using shared infrastructure that did not require dollars as an intermediary. Parallel to this, energy exporters started denominating some contracts in currencies other than the dollar, or accepting multiple settlement options. The petrodollar framework that had reinforced American monetary power since the 1970s did not disappear overnight, but it began to erode at the margins. Each alternative route carved away a small piece of the dollar's exclusive role. Overlaying these developments on the historical pattern reveals a familiar contour. Stage 1, rise. A nation ascends through innovation, in navigation, in extraction, in finance, in industry. Stage 2, peak. Its currency becomes the default medium for trade and reserves, trusted across borders, seemingly beyond challenge. Stage 3, overextension. Military deployments, foreign entanglements, and domestic promises exceed the sustainable capacity of the economy, leading to heavy borrowing and structural deficits. Stage 4, collapse. Not always a dramatic implosion, but a loss of exclusivity and a shift of trust toward other units of account. Portugal, Spain, the Dutch Republic, and Britain all followed this arc, each in its own way, over periods ranging from several decades to more than 2 centuries. Where then does the dollar stand? The evidence points to a currency still dominant, but no longer unrivaled. It remains the largest single component of global reserves, the primary unit for invoicing commodities, and the core of international finance. Yet its share is falling, not rising. Alternatives, once theoretical, now exist in embryonic but operational form. American debt levels and overseas commitments resemble, in ratio if not in exact structure, the late stages of previous monetary powers. The system still functions, markets still clear, but the assumptions that once underpinned its permanence are being quietly revised by those who must manage risk over decades rather than months. The transition ahead is unlikely to be clean or linear. When Britain yielded monetary leadership to the United States, the process took decades. The American economy had overtaken Britain's by the late 19th century, yet sterling remained central to global finance well into the mid-20th. The Dutch guilder's influence faded more abruptly as war and corporate collapse punctured the foundations of Amsterdam's financial system. Spain's decline unfolded over generations, oscillating between moments of apparent recovery and deeper structural weakness. What unites these cases is not the speed of transition, but the eventual outcome. No reserve currency retained its singular dominance once its issuers' debt, commitments, and competitors reached a certain critical mass. The future may not be defined by a single successor in the way earlier eras were. Instead of a world organized around one anchor currency, the next phase could be multipolar with several major units sharing influence: the dollar, the euro, China's renminbi, perhaps regional currencies, or even digital instruments issued by central banks and alliances. In such a system, power would be more diffuse, and no single state would enjoy the same ability to finance large deficits simply by issuing the money everyone else must hold. That would mark a profound change from the post-1945 order, but not from the broader sweep of history, which has always moved from concentration to dispersion and back again. What is certain is that the lifespan of reserve currencies has limits. On average, they have held their position for roughly 80 to 100 years. The US dollar has occupied this role since the Bretton Woods agreements in the mid-1940s. It is now well into its 9th decade as the centerpiece of global finance. The signs that presaged past transitions, rising debt, military overreach, growing alternatives, and a slow erosion of trust are visible once more. That does not dictate an exact timetable, nor does it guarantee a sudden crisis. But it does suggest that the era in which the dollar could be treated as an unquestioned constant is drawing to a close. For individuals living through such a shift, the change is rarely obvious in real time. Salaries are still paid, cards still swipe, screens still quote prices in the familiar units. Yet underneath this surface continuity, balance sheets, treaties, and trading systems are already adapting. Central banks quietly rebalance their reserves. Corporations negotiate contracts with new settlement clauses. Governments build infrastructure for payment channels that did not exist a generation ago. By the time the end of an era is broadly recognized, it is usually already history. 500 years ago, Portuguese coins bearing royal insignia crossed oceans on wooden ships. 3 centuries ago, Spanish silver pieces of 8 passed from hand to hand in ports from Seville to Manila. 2 centuries ago, ledgers in Amsterdam and London recorded debts and credits in guilders and pounds that merchants assumed would always dominate their world. Today, balances are tallied in dollars on digital screens. The instruments have changed, but the underlying pattern has not. Money follows power, power overreaches, debts grow, rivals organize, trust migrates, and a new order emerges where the old once seemed immovable. If history continues to rhyme, the dollar will not vanish, but it will share the stage with others in ways that reshape trade, savings, and sovereignty. The transition may be turbulent or gradual, contested or negotiated. What can be said with confidence is that the system born under the chandeliers of Bretton Woods is no longer in its youth. It is in its later chapters, approaching an ending that will only be clear in retrospect, when some future generation looks back and marks the moment when the world quietly moved on. In the end, the story of reserve currencies is not just about charts, ratios, or institutional design. It is about how societies choose to use the advantages they are given. Every dominant currency has granted its issuer a window of extraordinary freedom. Freedom to borrow, to project influence, to defer hard choices. Portugal used that freedom to build far-flung forts that outpaced its population. Spain used it to wage wars financed by silver that corroded its own economy. The Dutch used it to turn credit into empire until overstretch and conflict shattered their corporate engines. Britain used it to sustain an empire on which the sun was said never to set until the bill for 2 total wars arrived. The United States has used it to underwrite a global security architecture and a standard of living that rests, in part, on the rest of the world's willingness to hold and use its money. How long that willingness endures, and on what terms, will define not only the fate of the dollar, but the contours of the next era of global power.